Hello everyone, welcome back to our final lecture of our second unit of study, Foundations of Modern Nations. Today we're going to take a little bit of a break from what we have been looking at, all the various case studies, looking at the problems that have been developing in newly independent nations in the last half of the 1900s. Today we are going to take a deeper look at what was happening in Russia after the transition from the Soviet Union and the communist system that they had in place to a so-called democratic system under the Russian Federation. A lot of times our story about the Soviet Union, we talk about them in the Cold War, we talk about the collapse of the Soviet Union, but we really don't talk about the history that has happened since the collapse of the Soviet Union. So that's what we're going to look at today, how Russia, even though it doesn't kind of fit the same mold as a newly independent nation as some of these others, we are going to dive into what has happened in Russia since they broke off from that communist system, and in some ways how they are still the same old Russia today. So let's go ahead and dive in and take a look at what's been happening over the last few years and what I call Cold War 2.0. Russia in transition. From communism to capitalism, the failure of democracy. I think that's a pretty fair way to summarize it here. In 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there were a lot of difficult choices that had to be made. How do you go from a system in which the government owns literally everything in society, everything from the material goods to the factories, everything. How do you redistribute that amongst the people? Well, they came up with a system that they tried to use, and frankly, it didn't work too well. That system was called voucher privatization. Basically, citizens were given vouchers that represented shares of all this former state-owned property. Now, here's the problem. Most Russians are fairly poor. And what that, especially in the early 90s, so you can't eat vouchers. So a lot of people began to just simply sell their share of what they had gotten. And what this meant was there were basically a handful of people that were able to buy up most of these vouchers and basically get a monopoly on some of these goods. And some of these guys took over kind of the entire oil industry of Russia, or really any other major industry you can think of. All of this ended up in the hands of very few individuals, and they would become known as the oligarchs. Okay, the people that will run Russia for the next, really up until today. They are still run by Russian oligarchs. This was a tremendous opportunity for democracy to take root, and frankly, it went the exact opposite direction. A lot of these men that find themselves in with large quantities of the former Russian property, they begin to tie themselves with government officials. And what we end up seeing is that by the year 2000, with the rise of Vladimir Putin, about 70% of all Russian finances are controlled by 7 individuals. This is the true definition of an oligarchy, where the wealthy are in control of this society, and it's literally less people than you can count on 2 hands. This is not setting ourselves up for exactly a free and democratic society. The next point, politics. Russia is a failed democracy. Do they have elections? Yes. Are those elections accurate? Are they free of corruption? Absolutely not. In fact, anytime I see Vladimir Putin winning with like 99% of the vote, it is a good reminder that these democracies, this is not a true democracy. These elections are not fair. There have been dozens of opposition leaders that have run against both Putin and other cronies of his that have ended up in jail or have simply just died or disappeared. Journalists go missing all the time. Journalists are assassinated. Those that are critical of the government. This is the exact opposite of a free society. Now, I keep referencing Vladimir Putin. He is the current leader of Russia and frankly has been since about 2000. The Russian constitution that was put in place does limit the time a person can be president, but he has been able to work around that. First, as serving as prime minister, kind of just making up that position, but then ultimately getting the constitution changed to allow him to serve. Now, Vladimir Putin is no friend of the United States. Early on in his career, he served as a KGB officer. That is the equivalency of the CIA for Russia. He was in East Germany during the Cold War. He would eventually be the head of the KGB and their successor organization. He rose to prominence under Yeltsin. We didn't get into what happened at the very end of the collapse of the Soviet Union, but the first president of Russia was a man named Boris Yeltsin. And that is where Putin kind of comes in, rides his coattails, and will become chief of staff, a very important figure under Yeltsin's administration. Putin from the very beginning has been nothing but corrupt. He will have political opponents jailed and killed. He has denied free and fair elections, limiting the press, and we know of human rights abuses that have been conducted under Putin's regime. But that being said, Putin does remain a fairly popular figure in Russia, mainly due to the fact that he does put on this strong appearance. He does make Russia seem as if it is willing to, it is a powerful nation that is willing to do anything. In fact, frankly, even at times risk war with other nations to get their way. And frankly, this is what the Russian people for so long have been used to, a series of strong men that come in and basically say, screw human rights. We are going to take what we want and do what we want and, assert our authority. And that is what Putin, that is his MO. That is what he has always been like. So we do see under Putin, Russia has returned to this place of prominence in the world for all the wrong reasons. This is not a democratic society. This is not a society. This is still, and they're no longer communists, but at the same point, they are not our friends. And we need to remember that. There's a lot to be concerned with here. We're going to take a look at some of the Russian engagements that have happened since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and we'll begin with the Chechen-Russian conflict. Chechnya is a small region in southwestern Russia that, again, has a lot of different ethnic groups living within it. Chechnya is primarily Muslim, and the majority of Russians are Orthodox Christian. So there has been this tense, relationship between this region and Russia forever, but that has been compounded through various acts, including a series of wars that were fought where Russia invaded Chechnya early in the 90s. There have been some terrorist incidents that have taken place, but we'll begin here with the First Chechen War from 91 to 96. Chechnya did try to break off at this time, tried to declare independence, and that they were denied. You can see on the map on the right, kind of the small region known as Chechnya. Russia did invade to keep them a part of the Russian system, but eventually would withdraw. 30,000 people dead in this conflict, about 30,000 military dead, 80,000 civilian dead. That's a good reminder, something that I perhaps have not mentioned yet. Anytime you have war, it is almost always civilians that die in greater numbers than soldiers. And this is one of those examples where, homes were targeted and communities destroyed. And the Russians were, they were just bombing everything. So, over 100,000 people dead at the end of this. And that was not the end of violence. By 1999, we're going to see the Second Chechen War, in which this time we do have, there were some violent actions from Chechnya onto Russia. There were some terrorist incidents in which they invaded. There were a couple Chechen terrorists. The worst terrorist incident happened in 2002, where they took hold of a theater in Moscow and took about 900 people hostage. Ultimately, there'd be 117 hostages die in that terrorist incident. But it renewed calls for Russian authorities to go into Chechnya and to try and bring them under control. This war just ended in 2009, just a little over 10 years ago. About 80,000 people dying in that war. Moving away from Chechnya here, we want to talk about another area of former control, and that was the nation of Ukraine. Now, Ukraine once was a part of the Russian Empire, but like many Eastern European countries, Ukraine broke off in 1991 and became its own independent state. Now, Ukraine has been completely divided ever since this time. You have some people in Ukraine that want to be a part of the EU. They are pushing towards more Western, culture. They're pushing towards more Western style politics. They want to be a part of what's happening in Europe. You have another group in Ukraine that's kind of wanting more alignment with Russia. And in particular, the government of Ukraine has been pushing for more alignment with Russia. Well, that is a recipe for disaster, where the majority of the people want one thing and the government wants another. And what you had was in 2014, you had this civil war basically break out in Ukraine. The people rioted. There was a revolution that the people tried to overthrow the government in Ukraine. And Russia is going to use this as an opportunity to basically steal some land. Before I move on to the next slide, I want to point out that photograph in the bottom left. It's a very sad photograph, pretty well done here, but on the left-hand side you can see what the central square in Kiev looked like before the revolution, and then on the right-hand side you can see what the central square looked like after the revolution. And again, it was true fighting between the people and the government. This was a revolution, and the government opened fire on the people. I mean, this was a bad situation overall. Like I said, as Ukraine is kind of tearing itself apart, Russia is watching, and they use this opportunity to try and take back a small region of Ukraine called Crimea. Now, the invasion of Crimea, the Russians would send in troops, and I've included some pictures of those troops there. You will notice something unique about those troops, and that is there is no insignia on those troops' uniforms at all. You cannot tell what country they come from. You cannot tell who it is, their names, their ranks, anything. They will send in these little green men to attack Crimea, and Crimea was targeted for a number of reasons. Number one, it is quite wealthy. There were a number of Russian citizens that lived in Crimea, but the Russians basically said that they were coming in to protect Russian citizens living in Crimea, but ultimately they had a right to that land. They used the chaos of Ukraine to invade Crimea and to take it over. Now, for the days and weeks leading up to this takeover and to ultimately what would be a vote, the Russians began a propaganda campaign. And this is very important because we have seen this in our own country, but they are going to begin a misinformation campaign in which they publicly create, what we often call fake news. Don't let, how loosely that gets thrown around take away from what it actually means. The Russians were creating fake stories to try and scare the Crimean people into voting to break away and join Russia. Now, this disinformation that was put out there, it has been studied. I mean, it was open. I got a screenshot at the bottom left there of RT, that is Russia Today. That is their state-run television station, and this was broadcast not only in the United States but also in Ukraine as well. And for weeks leading up to the attack on Crimea, the Russians were pumping story after story about Russians being attacked in Crimea, and none of it was actually true. They were trying to create this scared. They were trying to scare the Crimean people into basically saying we need Russia to come in and protect us. You can see the weeks leading up to this invasion on the top, the chart there. what their stories were actually focused on in the weeks leading up to the invasion. The horrors of life. So they were talking about attacks against Crimean or Russian citizens in there, protests, the decay of Europe, terrorism, refugee crisis, sanctions. So they were, truly trying to get people scared enough that they would actually vote to leave and join Russia. The Russians, once they had taken over Crimea, they basically put out an election. That election supposedly returned back 97% of voters wanting to join Russia. That has been heavily disputed. We have no evidence that that election was legitimate. Again, you guys know people. It is. You can't get 97% of people to agree really on anything. So I highly doubt that this was a true election, but we do know that they pumped a lot of disinformation into Crimea before this election, and that's, this situation, we're seeing some tactics the Russians are using here. Successfully, it's working. That's the thing. They pump out these fake news stories to get people scared to act a certain way, and that's exactly what happened in Crimea. And you better believe that they learned a lesson here that they have since applied to other regions, and we're going to see a couple of those here soon. Final note on this, there is still fighting between the Ukraine and Russia today. This is still going on. This is something that has not gone away, and these two nations are openly at war with one another. Again, in fact, this would the United States would be getting involved at one point, and I won't get too much into it here, but the first impeachment trial of President Trump dealt specifically with this issue because he was calling basically he had denied aid that Congress had set aside for Ukraine, and in a phone call with the Ukrainian president basically told him kind of a quid pro quo, meaning I will do this for you if you do this for me. And he specifically asked the Ukrainian president to investigate Joe Biden and his son, and basically if he did that, then he would open up the funds for Ukraine. So the U.S. sadly got involved in all this, and it resulted in an impeachment trial for President Trump, who of course was impeached by the House, but was able to keep his position as the Senate voted to keep him in. Now, as I said, this disinformation campaign, what Russia is understanding is they no longer have to, it's not the Cold War anymore. Russia does not have to roll tanks through the streets to get their policies in place throughout the world. They were able to basically create a bunch of very cheap news stories that got retweeted, that got spread on social media, and that message got out. And what they realized is that if you create enough confusion, you can get people scared, and you can control the narrative. They have a number of outlets that they use to do this. Russia Today, as I said, I see their clips all the time on Facebook, people spreading them. They have a state-run radio program called Radio Sputnik. And in fact, Radio Sputnik began broadcasting in Kansas City in 2020. This is so just mind-blowing that the Russians literally have a state media agency running out of Kansas City in 2021 now. Guys, this is still happening right now. We need to wake up and realize that this is something that this misinformation, this disinformation that Russia is putting out there is to create confusion and to sow seeds of division within our own country. And it works. That's the sad thing. In 2016, we know for a fact, this is not politically biased, this is a fact. Facebook identified 126 million people that were exposed to Russian disinformation, meaning that the Russians had created fake news stories. They had put them out there to try and cause division in America. They were about everything from Black Lives Matter to other issues that are heavily divisive in America. 126 million, that's half of the United States, was exposed to at least one of these stories in 2016 leading up to the election. We know this. This is a fact. Twitter reported 36,000 Russian bots that they were able to identify. This is a war that Russia is waging on us, and frankly, you could argue that they are winning. Because it's not just the United States. They have done the exact same thing in Africa, in France, in Spain, and as we already identified, in Ukraine. Part of the fighting between Russia and Ukraine, the Russians actually shot down a civilian airliner, Malaysia Flight 17. These were filled with just normal citizens, happened to be flying over Ukraine, and the Russians attacked it, maybe not knowing that it was a civilian aircraft, but they did shoot the plane out of the sky, and immediately we saw the Russian government start putting out fake news that it was the Ukrainian rebels that had actually fired the shots, even though there was video evidence on the ground that that was not the case. This disinformation campaign, if we truly just want to, laugh it away, we are going to be left behind. This is something that the Russians are doing actively on a daily basis, and it is a much cheaper way to fight wars than, as I said, rolling tanks through the streets of Prague. So this is something that is happening right here, right now, and quite literally in our own backyard. Cold War 2.0, it is still going on. Even though the Soviets aren't around, the Russians are still not necessarily our friends, and especially Vladimir Putin. There's a lot of corruption going on there and starting to influence nations around. Guys, that will do it for our second unit here. I hope you enjoyed today's lecture, and as always, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to shoot me an email. I'd be happy to get back to you. Thanks.